Hello, it's Ben Lewing here at EIF Towers. Not that it's ever been described like that before, but you have Kirsten Asmussen as well, and Kirsten and I are going to be taking you through the next hour or so, looking at our understanding of the evidence on language and communication. Welcome everyone who's joining us on this webinar. I think we have about 40 or so people who registered, which is fabulous. Nice to be with you this afternoon. So, I'm just going to take you through. That's me. I'm an assistant director at EIF. I'm responsible for policy and practice, and you have the two different sides, if you like, of EIF's work. So Kirsten leads on the development of evidence, the understanding of evidence, and my role is focused on how that evidence is applied in practice. So today in the webinar, we're going to cover three things, which we talked a little bit about when you registered. So Kirsten is going to look at the evidence for school readiness, in particular at key milestones in children's early language development and the processes that promote them or place them at risk. She is also going to look at what we know about interventions and whether they work or whether they don't. And then I'm going to look in particular at applying what you've heard to the peer review process. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Early Intervention Foundation's maturity matrix. And just quickly on that, one of the reasons for holding this webinar is to help the areas that are either planning on going through the peer review process or are part of the peer review teams themselves to understand the evidence and how it might help with their thinking around peer review focused on the early years with speech, language and communication as the lens for that. So first of all, a couple of words about the peer review itself. You will undoubtedly be very familiar with what this is. The information that you have in your slides on the left-hand side shows how, from the DFE's perspective, a focus on communication and language in the early years is a fundamental part of how they understand improving social mobility. And they've put a wide range of resources to support development on closing the word gap, which is ambition 1 in the Social Mobility Action Plan. On the right-hand side of your slide, you can see a DFE slide which looks at some of the key components of their local program for supporting local authorities and partners to improve early language outcomes. So the three boxes in blue and orange focused in particular on the peer review program, which you'll be familiar with, the Early Outcomes Fund, which is supporting areas to innovate on early language outcomes, and the maturity matrix, which, as I say, I'm going to talk briefly about, which is the conceptual framework which sits behind the peer review program. So the matrix itself, you may already have seen this. If you haven't, it's available on our website. As you may also know, it's one of the common tools that we use to help local areas with planning and development of local systems. We've published a range of different versions of matrices, including those focused on reducing parental conflict and 0 to 19 systems and gangs and youth violence. This particular one focuses on the local early years system through the lens of language and communication. And as you can see in the slide, our matrices have 4 dimensions. Each of those is broken down into key elements. And then for each of those, they have descriptors for 4 different progress levels. So a local area can judge how much progress they've made and how much more they need to do. So I'm going to pass over to Kirsten now, and then once Kirsten has completed her input, I will bring you back to the maturity matrix just for some very brief reflections about the implications of this for your peer review. We will also be taking questions. So if you have a question as we move through the webinar, then please do submit your question, and we will come to those at the end. We'll take each of them in turn when we reach the end of our slides. Kirsten.
Thank you, Ben. Okay, so I'm going to talk about school readiness first and what we mean by that, and then how it's supported by children's language development. So according to the World Health Organization and also the Center for Disease Control in the United States, school readiness actually takes place in 4 domains, not just in terms of children's cognitive domains, and we understand those to be the child's physical, cognitive, behavioral or / self-regulatory, and social and emotional development. The sorts of behaviors that we consider to be optimal at age 5 when children are ready for school is good physical health, the right size and weight, good dental health, they're able to hop, skip, and jump, and they can hold a pencil so they can write out their letters. In terms of their cognitive development, we are looking for a child who can recognize his or her letters, can count and know what the meaning of counting is, so they just aren't reciting through the numbers, but they know that 5 means 5 things, knows the days of the week, and knows the names of many animals and where they live and how they live together, their relationship to each other. Also, a school-ready child is a confident communicator. The child can listen and can also follow directions. And by the age of 5, that child should have a vocabulary of approximately 10,000 words. By the age of 5, children should be able to manage their impulses. This means that they can manage their emotions, including anger and the ability to, burst out and say things. They're able to sit still and wait and take their turn, and they can concentrate and work quietly when they're asked to. Finally, in terms of children's social and emotional development, we are looking at a child who is self-confident, but is also interested in others' point of view, can play nicely with others, and respects fairness. Before I move on, I want to point out that these domains are overlapping, and in fact, they overlap much more strongly than we have depicted here, but it's important to realize that each domain supports development in the other one. So I want to start with a quiz question here. When it comes to children's development, which makes the biggest difference, nature or nurture? So I know I can't hear you, so I'm not going to wait for you to give me an answer on that, but it's a trick question because neither makes a difference. It's always both, all of the time. But one point I want to make out here is it's not always an equal contribution. And that depends on what the child brings to his or her development at any one point in time, and also what's going on in the child's environment. So let's start with the notion that the child is the engine of his or her own development. At every moment of the child's development, they are an active participant. It's not just like they're a receptacle and information is coming in. They're constantly processing and understanding that information. And that the ability to do so is governed by their capabilities at any given point in time. So here we're looking at a baby, and that baby is able to sit up on its knees and play with those toys, but you would not be expected to teach that baby how to tie his or her shoes, because he or she cannot even sit up in a way to put a shoe on their foot. They don't have the attention span to pay attention as to what would take place, etc. So everything that child learns is governed by his or her level of development at that point in time. In this respect, the child's skills beget skill. But it also takes a village, and this is incredibly important. Early cognitive development is strongly shaped by the child's family, which is in turn shaped by the culture and society. Just think about language and how language is very much a cultural thing. And children become clued into their own language already within the first few hours of birth, not before. Much of this learning takes place spontaneously in the absence of direct instruction. So think of a child that's been taught how to walk. That just doesn't happen. Very much of this learning takes place, particularly during the first 5 years, through no direct instruction from anybody. And this kind of learning is what we call biologically primary. However, the role of the village is to help children learn the things that can only be taught. So for example, most children will learn how to speak spontaneously, more or less, or it feels that way at least, but they won't learn how to read. And even though they have the biological capability of learning how to read, that needs to be taught to him. And so we need to understand, we call that biologically secondary. That means that they have the capacity to do it, but it is very much the role of their culture to be able to give them that capacity, to feed into that capacity. So let's just go very quickly as to how this works. We call this the ecological model, starting again with a child as the engine. The child is what determines what he or she cannot take in and out. As I pointed out earlier, the child's previous development determines what he or she can learn at any given point in time. So that's determined by the child's genetic makeup, their antenatal development, whether or not they experienced a healthy full-term birth, the child's gender, the child's physical health. Just to explain, I'm looking through the video camera right now. The child's temperament, to the extent that that is biologically determined, and there is an aspect of it that it is. What the child personally likes and dislikes, and of course, the child's previous development. Then we move on to the family. Now, the family is critical for ensuring the child's safety. This involves supporting the child's physical needs, but also the child's social, emotional, and cognitive needs. Factors that make a difference are the parents' physical, mental, and well-being, the parents' history of being parented, and that helps them decide, well, how should they be reading with their child? What should they be reading to their child? How should they play with their child, etc. Their beliefs and attitudes about children's age and development, the quality of the interparental relationship and the extent to which they are supporting each other to support their child's development, the structure of the family, and that we're talking about things like whether it's a single parent household or a dual parent household or an extended family household, then the family size and birth order, family income, and finally parental level of education. And I want to highlight those two right now because those have a very strong influence on children's language development. They're also very highly interrelated, but they're two separate processes. Families, of course, don't exist in isolation. They live in communities. And the communities provide the infrastructure for them to live and be able to feed their children and take care of them. They also provide transportation for people to move from one place to another and access the services that they need to help them thrive. The things that make a difference are the things that all of us in this room are involved in, such as healthcare, dental care, adult mental health, child mental health, enriching childcare, preschool, educational psychologists, and speech and language therapists. And I'm not going to name all of these, but all these important community resources have been known to make a difference, and we'll talk very specifically about how they can make a difference at the end of this presentation. Finally, I'm not going to go into any great detail, but it's very important to acknowledge that all of these processes take place within society, and fundamentally society determines the strength of relationships within all the other systems. So as we spoke previously, that includes language, it includes the beliefs of the culture, and that has to do with how children are taught and disciplined. It determines what access there is to research and technology. So for example, some cultures don't have access to the internet, whereas others, it's a daily part of their lives. Things about employment and military laws, et cetera, et cetera. So just going through very quickly, all of these things make a tremendous difference to the ways in which communities can help families take care of each other and their children, and also support the ways families interact within the home and with their child. Most of what we talk about with early intervention is about things that taking place at the community, family, and child level, but you have to always recognize that if something is happening at the society level, so for example, there aren't jobs for people to get, the GDP doesn't allow it, that it will have a very severe impact on everything else that happens below or within the nested systems below. So let's talk about children's competencies, and particularly children's language. Just to talk briefly, this is part of a big report that we came out with already at Christmas time, and we use this framework that we brought from the National Academy of Sciences. which is a US-based organization, but also has presence on it from the UK. And they identified, in fact, that there are 26 important child competencies that children have and they learn within and they develop within during the first 5 years of life. And that everybody in the children's workforce should have some understanding about development in these competencies. So we've actually done 2 reports in this space. The first is the one that I just described to you on the left, key competencies of early cognitive development. And when I start talking about children's language, most of what I'm going to say from here on out is in that report. But I also want to flag our language as a child well-being indicator and point out that both of these reports have led into a very recent government announcement, which took place last November, about the importance of chatting, playing, and reading with children to improve social mobility. There's a brief video from them. So this highlights the need that if we want to improve social mobility in this country, we need to start early, and a good place to start is with children's language. So just going back to the competencies report, we started with 4 areas of knowledge because, in fact, these begin with competencies that children are, in fact, born with. They're perceptual competencies, and some people call this core knowledge, from which forms the building blocks for all other learning. So this is children's understandings of objects. That's about how objects interact with each other in time and space, about, if you pick something up and it falls down and it drops, children need to learn how that happens. And it also has to do with how children understand people and what people are thinking. We sometimes call that theory of mind. It's also children's awareness of number. In fact, already at birth, children can tell the difference between more or less. And as they develop, they become much better at discriminating that difference and being able to assign numerical values to that. And finally, children's awareness of words. And one point I want to emphasize here is that children come into the world with this perceptual awareness, and then they're constantly developing little theories about what's going to happen through expectations, and they're testing these theories. So sometimes we do call these things theories of objects, theories of mind, theories of number, etc. What we've done in this report is we've mapped out milestones, as Ben mentioned, of children's development already at when they are born and then throughout the first 4 years. What I'll continue to talk about now is what those milestones look like for children's language development. Firstly, language development is not one thing. As we've highlighted in our Language as a Child Well-Being report, it actually starts with comprehension, but then there are 4 different parts to it. One is phonology, and that's the child's ability both to hear differences between sounds and also then replicate those differences. So when children are born, they can actually identify differences in all of the phonemes in every single different language. And by phoneme, I mean something like an a sound or a ba sound or a da sound. Children can differentiate the difference between those sounds when they're born. And then by the time they're 6, 7, 8 months, something called perceptual narrowing takes place, where they only focus in on the differences within their own mother tongue or multiple mother tongues if they're raised in a multilingual home. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more in a minute. Semantics refers to their vocabulary. Pragmatics refers to how they use the language. So do they know when to ask a question or what a command means, etc. And grammar involves their ability to be able to string the words together in the right sentence, and that usually develops during the second half of the second year of life. But all of these are important processes that happen simultaneously, more or less, and they all contribute to children's ability to learn at school. So just to go very briefly, these are the milestones. I'm just kind of going through this quickly. You'll all get the slides just to show you where they are. A couple of things I'd like to highlight here is that by the time children are about 2, 2.5, they will have a 500-word vocabulary, and that will have doubled, as I mentioned previously, to over 10,000 words by the time that they're 5 years old. So already before children are born, the building blocks of learning language have begun by the time they can start hearing, which is around 24 to 26 weeks. Already at that period of time, they will have become used to the tone of their mother's voice and the rhythm of their mother's voice. And within a few days, if not hours of birth, they will show a preference for the mother's voice, as well as female voices. That recognition then forms the building blocks for the rest of the language that they begin to learn. One of the ways that parents help children with this is through what we call infant-directed speech. Some people may have heard of this before as motherese. That is not as considered as politically correct anymore, so we use terms like infant-directed speech. But here I've got a brief video of my uncle, who is, I believe, around 73 in this video, and he is talking to his 8-week-old granddaughter, and his wife is videoing this. And so I'm just showing this as an example of how just about anybody, including an untrained uncle of mine, can use infant-directed speech with a little baby.
You're ready to do that.
Keep talking, Dad.
This baby is something. There's something else. What are you saying? You see Grandpa? See Grandpa's feet? Oh, you're touching Grandpa's face. You touched Grandpa's face. Let's try it again. Oh, you touched my face. Yeah. How did that feel? Did you like that? Oh, now you're touching your own face. Yeah.
Djokovic beats Murray in Beijing semifinals.
I know. Djokovic beat Murray? Good. I don't like Murray either. I don't like Murray, but I like Djokovic.
Oh, wow.
Are you going to play tennis someday? Huh? Maybe you will. Well, okay.
There are just a few things I'd like to highlight about that. First, my uncle, he didn't go to baby talk school. He knew how to do that naturally. And in fact, they find that the vast majority of adults talk that way to babies. So do children, as a matter of fact. Already 4-year-olds are talking that way to babies. And it doesn't seem like anybody has taught them how to do that. People do that naturally. And when they talk that way, they are emphasizing the phonemes of their own language and highlighting certain words and sounds, and people believe that that helps baby understand their phonemic environment. The other thing that he's doing is he's treating her very much as a conversational partner. He's taking turns with her, and she's taking turns too. She's only 8 weeks old, and she knows how to do that. She's also imitating him. Now, she's not necessarily doing that consciously. People believe that perhaps that is reflexive, but nevertheless shows what children come into the world with in terms of their abilities to be social creatures. Other thing I'd like to highlight is that he is bringing her into the entire family conversation as a member. Now, she's not going to understand what he's saying to her right now, but he's talking to his son about the tennis match, which is on television. He actually talks to his son in an adult voice, and then when he talks to her, he changes the way he speaks, but yet makes it very clear that she's part of the whole conversation. And all of those behaviors help motivate her to talk and also increase her understanding of how language is used and what language sounds like. So during the first year of life, already by 6 months, babies are able to recognize their own name. Around that time, they start babbling, and over time, it becomes increasingly canonical to mimic or mirror the language that they're hearing in their own home. So buzz and does, nuzz and muzz start occurring at this time. And then at around 9 to 11 months, babies also start to point. And by the time they're 12 months old, they can say up to 5 words typically. Now, what supports this development at this time? First of all, that pointing is a very important, it's a watershed moment in children's development because it's a point at which children understand that something that they're looking at, that their caregiver is also seeing, and it's something that can be communicated about. And once they figured that out, then they become very interested in naming things. And research suggests that families who engage in more joint attention activities, where they are playing with toys or other objects like cups or bottles, or there could be a dog, or drawing their attention to a shared event, facilitate the learning first of nouns and then verbs. So here I have another brief video to share with you.
From about 6 months, infants can start to involve external objects in face-to-face interaction. Progress in their motor development, for example sitting up on their own or crawling, enables them to reach and touch different things in their surroundings. When an infant and their caregiver both coordinate their attention to a specific object or event and are aware that they are both doing so, we say they are in joint attention.
Què són aquestes joguines? Oh, això vols? Si són les claus del cotxe, que són meves. Mira què fa aquesta, mira. Un pito.
Episodes of joint attention are the ideal setting in which babies can come to understand how people use words.
T'agraden els colors? Que maco, eh? És groc, és vermell...
When adults and babies are interested in the same object and the adult talks about its name or its main features, it is particularly easy for babies to pick up on the function of what the adult is saying.
Qui és aquesta nena? Qui és aquesta nena? Sí.
So just something that I'd like to highlight here is the narrator on there is actually Professor Danielle Matthews from the University of Sheffield, and they led on this video series. It's worth checking out. Also to point out that she was one of the reviewers for this piece of work. Oops, that wasn't supposed to happen. So now let's go talk about language learning during toddlerhood. So during the beginning of toddlerhood, the beginning of the second year, babies, like I said previously, can speak around 5 words, and actually word learning is very slow. So they may be learning a word once a week or maybe once every 2 weeks, et cetera, et cetera. And then all of a sudden, by the second half of the second year, they have an explosion. That typically by like I said, by the end of the second year, they're speaking up to 500 words, and they do this through a process called fast mapping. So if you look at the flashcards on the left side of the screen, you will see that the way researchers check this out is there's a familiar animal there, a zebra, and a not familiar animal, except for this numbat here, unless you watch the recent Australian series on the BBC. But anyway, so you say to the baby, which one is the numbat, and they will automatically point to the one that's not familiar. They do this deductively, and then they'll remember the word forever. To the right is just explicit teaching. You would do that through a flashcard. So you might show the baby the word mangosteen. They will remember that as well, but not as well through the fast mapping, because that's a little bit more cognitively challenging, but also helps them remember much more quickly than the other way. Where are we not going? So during the second year and the third year, children learn how to use language in a variety of different ways for a variety of different pragmatic purposes. They learn how to ask questions. They start to think about things like pronouns and numbers, et cetera, et cetera. And again, it is the quality of the language and the language interactions that they have with other people. Reading, of course, is very important, but it is not as important until maybe the latter part of preschool. Right now, it is the conversations that make the big difference. And here in this video is the same little girl who was in the previous one. I think I need that. The previous one, getting some scaffolding from her big sister, who is off to the left of the screen, telling her the difference between brothers and sisters.
You're not my sister, I'm your sister. I'm your brother. No, you're not my brother. Big people turn into brothers. And I'm not your brother. You're not my brother. No, you're my sister. No, you're not my sister. You're not my sister. I'm your sister. I'm his. No. No, you're not my sister. I'm your sister. You're making me so tired, Melanie. I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to talk to you even.
Okay, so neither one of them got it right. But it is that process of talking about it and learning how to get it right, which is what is so important about making the difference. So I don't think either one of them still knows what a brother is at that point. And it's not surprising because they were being raised by their mother and their mother's extended family, and that's all girls. And they don't see very much of my cousin's family, which are all boys. I think they've got it all figured out by now, however. And both of them are pretty good talkers at this stage. So from the third year onwards, children's language becomes increasingly decontextualized. They're not talking about things in the here and now anymore, but they're talking about things that they either remembered or things that they're looking forward to, or things they maybe saw on television or something that they know about in the book. They might be also talking about things that they've imagined. And what they found is that children's vocabulary at the age of 3 already is associated with their language skills at age 8. So this is actually an important milestone in children's development. And again, caregivers support children's early language at this period of time by talking to them about things that they're very interested in. But also this is a point at which having books makes a difference, because children start to, getting ahead of myself, sorry about that. Start to talk about learn how to speak in narratives. So anyway, going back to this point that the age of 3 is very important because this is when we also see real differences, income-related differences in children's early development. Some of you may have heard of something called the 30 million word gap. That has to do with the difference that has been measured in some studies between the number of words a low-income and an upper-income child will have heard by the age of 3. It's not only the number of words that is the big difference, but it is the number of conversations that these children will have and the size of their vocabulary. So upper-income children's parents talk to them constantly. They use a much more diverse vocabulary, and there are much more turn-taking taking place in those conversations compared to children in low-income families. And people believe that this is what contributes to the very large difference in their vocabulary as that is at age 3 and then continues to exist throughout their education. Between 3 and 5, children start to speak in multi-class sentences, and they also start to talk to people in terms of narratives. So what they're telling them has a beginning, middle, and end. And this is very important within Western cultures in terms of how people communicate. And so this is where books make a big difference because they help children think and talk that way. And also then having the opportunity to engage in reading and know about that also increases their pre-literacy skills. So we have what we call here a developmental cascade that starts with children's early perceptual capabilities and their ability to develop theories of objects, mind, and number, which then interacts with their early phonemic awareness to understand what words are, and suddenly they learn the words for all the things that they're developing the theories for. That in turn contributes to their pre-literacy skills as well as their social emotional development and their ability to regulate their own language, which also behavior, which also has a linguistic component. And then over time, this contributes to their school readiness, as we've discussed previously. And as I said earlier, children's language skills at age 3 are predictive of their academic achievement by the time they're in primary school and beyond. This might be difficult to view here, but this is a diagram that we've developed for our competencies report that again explains these milestones as I've just discussed, and then at the top shows the factors that have been identified through research to support children's language development, and then on the bottom, factors that have been identified at each developmental stage to pose significant risks. So risks occurring during the antenatal period include anything that could be going on that is genetically determined. Obviously, that affects a child throughout the life course, but that comes with a child basically from the point of conception. A premature birth actually has a significant impact on the child's language, and we don't always necessarily see that in the first 2 years of life. That's something that actually may become more evident when the child is 4 or 8 or 12. Toxic substances in the room have been are associated with children's language problems. And the maternal age is associated with children's language. We put this here because obviously the maternal age is there from the antenatal period onwards, but of course the way it affects the child is after birth. But basically, the older the mother is, the more likely they will engage in longer conversations with their children and use a richer and larger vocabulary. And that's particularly different between the ages of 30 and upwards and below the ages of 20. So we're going back to our model again with a child. These are the things that make a particular difference in terms of the children's development. So in terms of genetically related language problems, it's expected that approximately, people don't know for sure, but 7% of the population will have some sort of language delay that may have to do with their genetic makeup. As I mentioned, antenatal development, whether or not they have a full-term birth, their gender. Actually, girls learn some words before boys do and vice versa. It doesn't make a big difference in the long run, but it's something that might be picked up in early testing. Their physical health, including hearing, although again, that's something that they catch up on, as I mentioned, maternal age and previous development. Risk and protective factors during infancy and beyond, and these are at each stage of development. So as I mentioned previously, it's that high quality infant-directed speech that's so important, and people believe that that is one of the driving forces behind income-related language differences, as well as high quality joint attention and triadic object play. That's what we call that play with the toys. Just like the mother in the video was blowing the toy for the baby, really capture the baby attention. Baby's already realizing at that point that that's something that they can communicate about. Degree educated parents, that is one of the biggest differences. That's highly tied to income. And the reason people think it makes such a big difference, it is fundamentally an issue of vocabulary. In fact, people will say that the income-related language gaps are fundamentally driven by children's vocabulary. Book sharing versus book reading, actually. It is about sharing books together and using them as a point of talking. As I mentioned previously, reading per se is not specifically beneficial until children are between the ages of 2.5 and 5. Birth order and siblings. In fact, firstborn children can learn how to speak or say their first words and have that words for up to 6 months before their siblings. Normally everybody else catches up. It's not a significant difference in the long run, but it's something, again, that could be picked up in testing. And more than one language spoken at home. That's not a risk factor, but it will, again, could contribute to delays before the age of 3. So basically, children who are mastering more than one language at a time before the age of 3, there may be slight delays, but at the age of 3, then they will have totally mastered 2 or more language systems, depending how they're exposed to them. However, if children are in one linguistic situation and they've mastered one language and then they go to school and they have to learn another one, it may take a little bit more time, and then there's some frustration involved because they have to map the new language onto the old one. Having said all of that, a 3-year-old will still learn relatively quickly a new language. So, in 2 or 3 years, that's a significant period of time, but it's as long as that took them to learn the first language. And high levels of deprivation are indeed a risk factor for all sorts of important reasons. And this is where we get into income and it being different from the parent's education, because it really limits the kinds of experiences that families can participate in terms of going and engaging in enriching activities and having an enriching home learning environment. So these are the things that make a difference on a family level, just to recap. And I'm highlighting this here. So in the previous slide, we talked about 7% of the children who maybe have a genetically based language delay. But what's a bigger player is really income, as the DFE video highlighted earlier on. And then all the other things that I just mentioned. Some of you may be wondering about parental mental health. People have found that in some studies that it does make a difference, but that's usually only when it occurs when the family is also living in poverty. That is because income is, in fact, an amplifier of all the other problems going on. And the families don't have the resources really to make up for it. But when the children are raised in more affluent homes, you normally don't see any differences in their language development. And that's usually because there's another caregiver who can give them the stimulation that they need, and they're still exposed to enriching learning experiences. So what do we know about early intervention? On our guidebook, we've identified 5 programs that are home visiting programs that have been shown to improve children's vocabulary. And then also, just recently, we've put the Nuffield Early Language Program, which is a very enriching and actually very good curriculum that can be offered through early years education. There is also some, although not as strong as the interventions that I'm just mentioning right now, evidence to underpin different forms of speech and language therapy. Unfortunately, many of these have not undergone very rigorous evaluation, or what we do find is that children can and do catch up quite frequently, and so they don't have the impact that one might assume. What do these effective early interventions have in common? Firstly, they start early. The home visiting programs that we identified, 3 of them actually start at the time the baby is born, and they last for 3 years, and they involve weekly home visits. Secondly, they're targeted on the basis of need, and that's typically on the basis of family income. Thirdly, they last for a long time. There's none of them that's less than 30 weeks. And fourth, the ones that we've identified in our review are all led by either a qualified and trained teacher or health visitor or home visitor. And so an example of this is Family Nurse Partnership. It's targeted because it's selecting mothers expecting their first child or teenage mothers. Then parents receive the program for 2.5 years, actually. And during these visits, mothers learn very explicit things that they can do to support their young child's learning, including their language. It's underpinned by 5 RCTs. There's a lot of controversy about the one in the UK, but I think that we need to acknowledge that of the very few positive outcomes that it did observe, children's language was one of them, and that was not at one time point, but 2. So things that can make a difference include improved antenatal care, health visiting, enriching childcare, starting actually from the age of 2 onwards. That's where we have the evidence. A curriculum-based preschool, and of course, support from educational psychologists and speech and language therapists. So just to recap, this is what all the factors that we've identified on the ecological levels of the child, family, and community that can make it or break it for children's language development. And now I'm going to go very briefly through some factors that we found. We could find no evidence that do make any difference. That's frequent ear infections. While that may result in temporary delays in children's language, children very quickly make up from these, and there's no evidence within the research level literature that these suggest at all result in any lasting language delay. The use of dummies. In fact, there's not a lot of research on this, but the studies that do exist suggest that children who can self-soothe, and that includes using dummies during the first year of life, have actually an earlier receptive vocabulary because they're paying attention to the sounds that they're hearing around them. Book gifting, that's different than book sharing. Book sharing does make a difference, but just giving a family a book or just briefly giving them a book with some training around it has been found not to be sufficient to have any lasting impact. And that's in rigorously conducted RCTs conducted in Australia and also in the United States. And then let's talk a little bit about that buggy study. That's the one that shows that if parents are taking their babies in buggies with the baby facing away from them, they don't talk to them as much as when the baby is facing them. And that's true, that there is a difference in conversation level, but I would like to point out here that when the baby is looking outwards, they're looking at all sorts of other things that they're seeing in the world that they can talk to the parents about. And as we just discussed previously, it is that triadic conversation, talking and looking at different things, which really supports children's development. So even though there might be differences in the level of conversation when the baby is facing away, those differences are not so much that they would necessarily impact a child's language. And just as a point of comparison, here is a very affluent family. They have to put their child in the back seat facing away from them for safety purposes. And I can guarantee you that in those situations, you still see high levels of language in comparison to children who are raised in less favorable circumstances. Talked very briefly that in our report, we actually identify over 20 different measures and discuss very briefly about how and when to use them and who can administer them. Just to point out here that they're very difficult to measure language in any way that's predictive before the age of 2. That's because of that catching up that I described previously. From the age of 3 onwards, though, it's predictive and becomes increasingly predictive from the age 4 onwards, and then it's very reliable. But for this reason, we say in the languages, the child indicator report, that it's very important to start measuring maybe at the age of 2 and then continually following up, because as I mentioned previously, children can grow in and out of language problems from there on out. Also just want to emphasize the point that there are no quick fixes. So for example, this little device on the right of the screen, this is a Lena device, and this is basically a language pedometer. And it's a little recording device that you can put into the child, and it will record all the words that the child hears. And people use these as part of intervention to try to improve the language that parents are learning with their children or sharing with their children. So then it encodes what's being said very quickly, and you can get a report that you can share with the parents. But what studies show is that you can get very short-term boosts in what parents will do with their children, but they're also very short-lived. And they're not enough to rectify the language gaps that are already identified at the age of 3. So that's just to underscore the report that you need to start early, and it needs to be long, it needs to be meaningful. So that's just to sum up here, what does this mean for early intervention in local areas? In terms of targeting, it might be wise to figure out where the low-income families are within communities and provide more intensive home visiting from birth onwards. This to follow the lead from Family Nurse Partnership and the other interventions that I described previously. They should be individualized to each family's needs and provided on a regular basis. That also means that the people who are delivering them should have the capacity in terms of the time to do this, to work with the families and develop a relationship with them. And this is not something that will happen overnight otherwise. The other thing is, don't do it all at once everywhere where there are low-income families, but maybe start in one patch and roll out over time. And that's all I have to say. I'm going to turn it back over to Ben.
Okay. Thank you, Kirsten. Please do keep your questions coming. We will come back to them in a moment. And I'm sorry, some of you seem to have not been able to hear the sound with the video. Sorry about that. Hopefully you can still hear us clearly. I wanted just to briefly bring us back then to the peer review and the maturity matrix at the heart of it. So this is simply a slide to remind you of the different components that are within the matrix, and to show that they span the sorts of things that you might be looking for or at a local level. So they include your local strategy, commissioning and approach to planning your workforce at a local level across the wider maternity and early years system. They also include the arrangements that you have for leading that local system, including partnership, the roles that individual leaders play, and the role that the community itself plays in leading support for families with small children. Thirdly, the matrix looks at the particular interventions, services, how those interventions and services connect to each other, how organizations work together, including sharing information and data. And then finally, it looks at how the local area approaches outcomes measurement and using and generating evidence. So just in summary, some brief thoughts to point you to some of the things that Kirsten talked about, which feel relevant in that structure of the matrix. The first is that this connection between language and communication and wider child development in the early years. For the peer review, people come at it with very different expectations of what it's about. So some people think it's about early education. Other people think it's about parts of the work that fall into the public health domain. Others see it as more about maternity services. It's all of those together, and hopefully you've seen from Kirsten's presentation the link between language and communication and the wider early years system. And the peer review is expected to look at both, essentially using that lens of language and communication to understand how the wider early years system works. The second point is that this system has a scope that spans from pre-birth all the way through to readiness for school. And some of those pre-birth factors are crucial in language and communication development, even if they're not seen by some of the players in this system. So for organizations that only get involved from the age of 2 or 3, some of those opportunities to influence language outcomes for children have already happened, have already been focused by other organizations in this system. The peer review is interested in all of those factors, all of those players in that system. The third point, again, Kirsten talked about this, was about making sure that interventions within your strategy are focused at families who can benefit most from them and have the right kind of intensity or dose. Just scattering evidence-based interventions across your system for anyone who wants to take them up is not going to be either an effective way of using resources or likely to impact on the most vulnerable families. Fourthly, for a system to work seamlessly for families, it seems to depend on a more joined up approach to workforce development. And this includes considering specialist roles, including what health visitors do as part of that system, for example, or midwives, as well as specific skills to engage vulnerable families. It's not just about having an intervention which has shown that it can work somewhere else. It's having the ability to connect that to families that need it, for them to actually want to participate and to stay the course. The fifth area that I would draw your attention to is, again, on the types of services that seem to be most effective. Now, clearly, we don't have a full picture of evidence about effective interventions, but from what we know already, there is an issue about intensity, and there is an issue about targeting on the basis of family income. So many of the families that we will be most concerned about are going to be families that can be targeted on the basis of family income, and they will require an intensity of support that isn't just a one-off. And many of the examples of services which have shown sustained impact are those which, as Kirsten said, continue over a lengthy period of time. We also know that individual interventions are not the answer alone, that they have to fit together as part of that wider system of pathways, the journeys that families take between different services. So local systems depend on how organizations work together. And that's a key part of what the peer review is about, looking at whether local stakeholders understand the part that each other plays, whether they use a common language, whether they recognize where what they do fits into what other people do. The seventh point that I'd make is around outcomes measurement. So it's crucial that local systems understand what we know about child development and use that to inform the outcomes measurement system at a local level, so that systems are really measuring what makes the biggest difference for children, not just the information which is readily available or easy to collect. And finally, there is a crucial issue here about continuing to test and learn. Just because an intervention or an approach has shown that it can work somewhere else doesn't mean that it will necessarily work in a new place. And we need to continue to grow the UK evidence. So a crucial point for part of that local system and for peer review peer reviews to consider how much are local areas using the evidence that they generate themselves, as well as drawing on evidence from elsewhere. I think that's all we'd want to say in the 2 slide decks that we've covered. So what I'd like to do now is look at the questions that you've submitted. I don't think you can see those, so I shall read them out. We have a number of points about sound. So if we could go down, there's a question here from Dulcie, which says, given the risk and protective factors for language development, what are your thoughts on using ASQ3 as a population level screening tool to predict school readiness and good level of development in the early years foundation stage profile? Kirsten?
We get asked that question quite often. I think it might be a good population indicator to look at the levels of children who are at the right age. But as a screening tool to refer on to other services, I know there's been a bit of controversy about it. Basically, it's a blunt tool. So you will identify problems, but then quite often when they go to speech and language therapists, they'll find that they aren't that serious. So it doesn't have the specificity and sensitivity that people would ideally like. On the other hand, it's better than nothing, and they're looking to refine that now with a new tool that will be announced later on through PHE.
Okay. Jane Rose has asked if we can forward the slides, which we can do. Yes, we will do, in fact. Claire Bethel, does the peer review look at what emphasis is given to interventions aimed specifically at children with disabilities that are identified in the early years? I guess the answer to that, Claire, is it depends. It depends on what the local area has decided they want the emphasis of their peer review to be. And it also depends on what the peer review team focuses on when they follow the key lines of inquiry. I know that with many of the peer reviews so far, indeed, they have looked at outcomes for children with disabilities and the sorts of interventions that make up that local system. But it will depend on the focus of each peer review. There's another question here from Dulcie. Which version of REAL has the good evidence? I have come across a number of different versions which have all been described as evidence-based.
Well, the version that we have on the guidebook is the only one that we've looked at. But I do know that they tried to do a shorter version of it, and it did not pass its initial tests. And I guess that just underscores the point that you do need this intensity. They tried to do a real light, and it didn't make a big difference. The problem is that you don't have a lot of purchasers for these larger programs. So the developers want to make it shorter, and they try to test it that way. But it's not just real. It's been actually a number of the different interventions on the guidebook. When they tried to do the short version, it has a big difference.
Mm. Okay, we have a question here about local areas generating their own evidence. So when you talk about local areas generating own evidence, what type of thing are you talking about? I have come across areas trying to do a mini RCT with just 30 children in each arm. Kirsten?
You could do one like that. That would be enough. You know, particularly when you're talking about something that that could be a serious language problem. So that would be a size that would be good enough. In fact, we've come out just recently with another piece of guidance called 10 Steps for Evaluation Success that talks about when you might want to start thinking about doing RCTs. In that document, we wouldn't recommend them, however, until you really know how to recruit the families and make sure that you've got people attending them on a regular basis and that you're getting pre-post change before you would do an RCT. And then, you know, once you get to that point, you're seeing a good pre-post movement. That level of movement will then tell you how big your RCT needs to be, not just 30. It could be 30, depending on the effect size. But very important to test out pre-post first. And if you get promising evidence from a pre-post study or a pilot study, as we describe it in the 10 steps thing, then you do need to think about RCTs. But before then, you may end up with disappointing results, and you won't necessarily know why, because it could be, for example, the sample size. On the other hand, is also if it's a small sample, which has been the case with many of the speech and language studies, is that if it does get a good effect, you don't know if it's representative.
Okay. I think that's all the questions. So it's your final chance. If you have one more burning question, get it in quick. Otherwise, we will bring the webinar to a close. So doesn't look like there are any more. So all that remains is for me to say thank you, Kirsten. And I hope it's been useful to you at the other end. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.